in rechten. Rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Moving forward.
All right, then we've set the stage, as it were, looking at representations, and you were able to see that there were some controversial aspects. A number of researchers found that others were fueling sort of misrepresentations and stereotypes. You yourself may be, well, of course, if you feel offended by what you've heard or what you've said, of course, you should respond. And Lionel Rougé will moderate the first round-table discussion. Unfortunately, Marie-Christine Jaillet should have been with us this morning, but unfortunately, she was not able to make it at the last minute. And so, well, of course, we we wish her a quick recovery. And in the meantime, I'll give the floor to Lionel Rougé. Well, yes, what it is we're trying to do is delineate the concept of the peri-urban, and where we may sort of make comparisons, although comparisons are not easy. As Martin Schuler pointed out, it is difficult to compare definitions. The issues are not the same. The purposes are not the same. But let's start with Annie Fourcaut, who teaches contemporary history at the University of Paris. I would like to know whether this whole concept is really new. I mean, even though the word peri-urban is new, at the end of the day, this may date back to before World War II. I mean, there may be other ways of explaining this other than this post-war phenomenon. Well, of course, I will not try and give a definition of peri-urban, but let me just say that in France and elsewhere, people tend to think that urban sprawls or detached houses to do with the fact that households have cars. People tend to forget that there is a stage of peri-urban extension, the fact you had these sort of defective housing around the Paris area, but you will find this around most French cities where people started building detached houses, and that was between the two world wars, because this was a response of property developers or property market players who responded to the housing crisis. So people selling plots of lands, and buyers were working-class households, either individually or people getting together to buy plots of land together. And so that brought about a first layer of, well, suburbs or detached houses in sort of this ring around Paris, and this is the former department of Seine. That was the greater Paris area. That was, and if you looked at the map of Goussainville being now a town right at the outskirts of the runways of Roissy Airport. So that if you land in Roissy, that's where it is, and then you have this sort of town, the railway or the railroad, and very suddenly you had thousands of plots of land, about 300 square meters. The owners of a large farm decided to sell the land, and that brought about the emergence of this pavilion extension of the village of Goussainville, and that is rather typical of that sort of peri-urban area as it emerged at the time. Now, this is a historical phenomenon. I do not want to dwell on that, but what I would like to say is this peri-urban extension, which is sort of anarchic, disorganized development of housing without any sort of state regulation. You have people building their own houses, this sort of thing, this sort of self-built houses, very small building companies run by Italians. And so these very often these houses, these cheaply built houses were refurbished. That's exactly what it looks like. This actually is in Goussainville. You could have other things like in Vitry, in these sort of industrial areas, and you could also have that sort of thing. But then, by the way, before the roads were built, this is what it looked like, because people sold plots of lands, people build houses, and there's no urban planning. Nobody paid for any kind of urban planning, for people who lived in the mud for 10 years. But when there was a beginning of some planning, some refurbishment after World War II, you had that sort of thing. And that's what the sort of thing you find now still in some of the suburbs outside Paris. So the interesting thing is that period was strongly criticized by politicians as well as activists of all kinds. It was felt to be something of this was felt to be something of a scandal. But people had been living in the mud, but they were quite happy to live in the mud, and in a way, this was reflective of the economic crisis of the 30s. People had their own houses, their own chicken run, their own little miniature farm, and because if you want to have a proper house, you had to have sort of a building permits and all that. But in the meantime, people made do with what they could during the crisis. They built their own houses, and they sort of eked out a living. That was the way of responding to the situation. Well, thank you, Annie, for this explanation, because you have a historical perspective, but you also have a socio-anthropological explanation. Now, Paola Pucci, you teach at Politecnico in Milan. What's the situation in Italy? Is the process very much the same? Do you have this layering, these layers, and the way in which people sort of took ownership of plots of land like you had in France? Is it the same situation in Italy? Well, you should think about the way in which this sort of a peri-urban phenomenon developed. In Italy, you have a rather specific situation, and compared with what we saw this morning, you have various interpretations of the phenomenon, but what you end up with is these semi-detached houses in France, whereas in Italy, if you want to come up with a definition, my own idea is that Italian peri-urbia is a specific form of scattering, but it is diversified both diachronically and synchronously. And I'll say what I mean by these funny words. The first forms of scattering or housing scattering you have in the center of Italy and in the outskirts of Milan. You have three phenomena emerging at the same time, not identical phenomena. First, you had peripheral areas around big cities. In the 70s and 80s, there wasn't much of that happening at all. People came from the countryside, and then you had living in small or medium-sized villages. But then you had specific circumstances. You have small factories and small companies that emerge in the countryside, and that made a big difference. You have Catini's work on the third Italy, the third economic power in Italy, where you have family businesses, but in the family, people lived and worked in the same place. So the Casa Fabbrica, the house factory, or the factory or come house, emerged in the economic context, and the production was then scattered all over the territory. And so these small factories in Italy were part and parcel of the manufacturing process. And then the third type was because you had in central Italy, you have in Abruzzo people living or redeveloping or reclaiming unused land, and that happened at the same time as a new form of urbanization. And so you had this sort of incremental growth that occurred. And so this is what was defining of Italy in the 70s and 80s. But in the 90s, the urban model was, well, the European urban model became the same in Italy. And so people, of course, had detached houses in peri-urban areas, but also on the immediate outskirts of the cities. It used to be, I mean, in 70s and 80s, this was a rare phenomenon, but this became much more widespread in the 90s. And so you may remember that before that, there was a sort of a minimalist approach, which was completely replaced in the 90s with a new approach where instead there was a sort of a sprawling. And so the Italian situation became much like the rest of Europe. You may remember the Barcelona Culture Forum. We looked at this phenomenon occurring in Italy that occurred in other cities in Europe and especially in the Mediterranean area. But now things are changed again, and I would like to refer to the work that we conducted in the region of the Greater Milan area. So this is not an administrative sort of area, but you can see that there's a real issue in terms of mobility and people commuting. We looked at the way in which building evolved, but also the way new infrastructure was built, especially telecommunications, because that redefined the area. And that Greater Milan area was defined by two types of urbanization. In the north, you had where specialized manufacturing occurred, was the first model, the model of the 1970s, where you had a close link between the house and the factory. And then the agricultural south was pretty much destroyed by a sort of a standard peri-urbanization, and that's where you could see the big difference between north and south. But now there are three phenomena occurring in this urbanization process. You have this sort of self-promotion, people acquiring land and becoming landowners or house owners. That's a sort of a form of social promotion. Then you have other phenomena, people using units of land, trying to have a better energy balances, a lower energy footprint, also more effective services. And then as part of the same process, you have these gated communities where you have something of an elite living in the better parts of peri-urban areas. And then on a much lower scale, you have an almost molecular change, the way in which the individual housing units were built. You had, if you look both at individual detached houses compared with big industrial areas, you find that in times of crisis, you have several families sharing a big house, and some of the factories were disused because of the economic crisis. So that there's a regrouping of people in individual houses, whereas in the past people used to spread out simply because they simply cannot afford to have a place of their own. So this is something found especially in the younger generations. People want to live in cheaper lodgings, cheaper housing, but also they want access to urban services, and they want to, because many of the houses initially had poor energy performance, and so they want to reduce their electricity bill. But then there's also disappointment, because when people lived in scattered areas, the services were not good, the commuting was difficult, and so people were disappointed in that and decided to go back to a more urban context. Well, thank you for this presentation of the Italian cakes. Thomas Sieverts, you are an architect, you are an urban designer. You published a book which was called Entreville in French, in its French translation. What is your view of the German situation compared with the French context? And indeed, if you compare histories, if you compare the French, German, and Italian developments, when cities spread out to smaller cities, what's so typical of the German situation?
Thank you very much. But this is too much. I think we should have a discussion and not just lectures. So I'm trying to concentrate on 3 points. In Germany, the critique is the same as in France, perhaps even more so. The myth of the concentrated European city is predominant. So that's the same case. But if we look at the official German policies, the official German policies for urban development are on this myth. The German planning takes a stance as if peri-urban areas do not exist. And they hope that they will just disappear because of the energy crisis and all that stuff. And this will be not the case. In Germany, depending on definition, 50% to 2/3 of the population live in peri-urban areas. And even if we have a slightly going back to the compact city because of aging, we shall have peri-urban areas for the decades to come. So we have to treat them regardless the critique about them. And if you do this, then you must ask yourself if the peri-urban areas are just a disaster in history, or if they have deep roots. And my opinion is that peri-urban areas exist as long as city exists. Even the oldest cities always have their suburbs, suburbs, because of people who couldn't be integrated into the old city. We all know them, the leather makers, the people who cut off the heads of the delinquents, the things of those elements always were outside. And every group of people who couldn't be integrated because of cultural reasons or religious reasons, they had to stay outside. And this, I think, is true up to our times. I think many people, quite a lot of people, need the kind of peri-urban area to live their life because they can't be integrated into an even more densified city. The second reason is, of course, that, and this is a problematic one, that what we see in Germany is, I think, by 80% a result of wealth. In Germany, the space used for living trebled in the last 50 years. So even a city which has not got one more inhabitant has 3 times the size now. And the main reason for suburbanization in Germany is just wealth. But I think there's more to the suburbanization. I think people, some ethnographs say people have become people in Africa in the light savannas, the edges of light forests. And I think people are edge-seeking animals. They want to have the 2 worlds. They want to have urban world and they want to have the landscape, the open landscape. Therefore, if you look at these areas closely, they are very edge-rich because people like to live at the edge. And I think there's quite a deep anthropomorphic reason, anthropology, that people prefer to live in the suburban world. So these are the situations in Germany, but I think it's true in many countries of the world. And now I think I stop here because I want to talk about the future of this peri-urban area later, if there's time left.
Well, this connection between the countryside and the city, you have layers in between, organizational layers, and these organizations change from one country to the next. Germany is a well-knit country, likewise Italy, but what of Switzerland? Do you have similar processes? Is it the fact that this sort of peri-urban space is a space in between? Martin Schuler, what is your view of this? I mean, you give us statistical definitions of peri-urban areas, but what's behind these statistical definitions in terms of this organizational structure? Well, Switzerland is a small country, and the transportation conditions are pretty good. Access is very good across the territory, and that is why, to some extent, there was a lot of urban or peri-urban sprawling, in as much as it was as connections were easy, and so you have small cities joining and merging into cities. You had the case in Geneva or Lausanne. Now, Switzerland is a wealthy country. Peri-urbanization since the 1918 has been carried by a middle or upper middle class, which means that the type of capital expenditure was mostly in detached houses. The difference now is that you have a sort of a demographic departure. I mean, people used to live in big sort of residential areas in the 1970s, but they lived in, as it were, big housing projects, and decided to move out to smaller detached houses. But what they find is that the services, the connections, the transportation wasn't as good, and maybe there is a connection with the people voting for the far right. It's not only that the living conditions are not very good, but people are becoming more demanding. The conditions are different now between the urban and the peri-urban areas. It used to be that you had an additional ring simply being built around urban areas, and so to a large extent, and in fact in Switzerland you can see that most of Switzerland is urbanized, but then you have segregation in between that. And so if you look at the behavior, at the voting behavior during elections in Switzerland, you can see now differences across urban lines, voting patterns being different from urban centers and peri-urban areas. Emmanuel Roux, you teach at the University of Grenoble. What are the challenges? What are the controversies in France? And do you find a resemblance with what happens in other European countries? Well, I do not know whether I can make comparisons with other European countries, but one thing I can do is look at one controversial issue. But before this, a few observations, and I would like to base these comments on a project I was involved in myself. We tried to have a definition of the rural area. Now, of course, many of the things said about rural areas have become somewhat standardized and may sound a bit trite, but we did come up with a definition and pictures, and we have a little book published by Karen Urel. But let me just make a few opening statements. I have, in fact, no pictures to show, but what I would like to say is that if you look at the peri-urban housing, one person in 4 lives there, one house in 4, one job in 10 is located there. You can have a quantitative definition of peri-urban areas, but that's not enough. But it's not. You haven't got one peri-urban area. You have different peri-urban situations, and you have to look at the typology of peri-urban situations. But it was said that, of course, statistics were not enough to define the peri-urban, and that is the case throughout Europe. You have many different realities in terms of space, in terms of social organization, in terms of economic situations. But we still have to try and approach the whole thing as one big category. And that's there lies the paradox, because you have different peri-urban realities, which means that it is rather difficult to have a blunt view of peri-urbia in general. And then, of course, we're not just looking at the outskirts of large cities. It is interesting also to look at areas that are further out in the territory, and that is the sort of area that is sprawling quickly. And then, well, of course, if people move out of cities, you have cities less dense. But while cities are less dense, then the outskirts are more dense. And so when you think in terms of sustainable development, there you have another paradox. And then looking at the peri-urban area, typically this is where families live. I do not want to start a discussion on the definition of what the family is, but it is certain that, well, the typical family, a couple with 2 children, it's not, well, at least statistically, you have an overrepresentation of this sort of household living in peri-urban areas. And so it is not, if you pass the metaphor, peri-urban areas is where you can breed children, and where you can look for an outlet for your families. But of course, peri-urban areas are populated by the younger generation. If you look at a scale of below 20 to above 60, you have areas where you have 3 young people under 20, and for every 2 older people over 60. But of course, if you have such a young population, you need daycare centers, you need kindergartens, you need primary schools, etc. Of course, you have these issues of facilities, but there are, other than issues of facilities, you have how to look after teenagers and how to look after senior citizens. And then in peri-urban areas, you think, well, people will say that this is where the middle class lives. To a large extent, you have people living in the middle class, the sort of middle professional classes, but there is some diversity there as well. Another observation is that looking at peri-urban areas, you still have revenue gradients. I mean, you think that the middle class lives in peri-urban areas, but there's a significant revenue gradient between the first ring, where you have, well, not well-to-do, but at least, say, better off classes living who have actual incomes. And as you move out towards more rural areas, you find people whose income is smaller, even though there are differences. But this is not so much to do with the fact that people living in peri-urban areas have high incomes, and that is my 7th comment. We find that this is where super women live. That is, this is typically the sort of place where you will find the largest number of working women who at the same time look after their households, the mothers that have children, and so you have the combination of both. They're working mothers who are also in charge of a household. So, and that challenges the sort of preconceived ideas. You have a very high number, 35% of working mothers, whereas the national average is only 30%. You have a few exceptions in some French areas. But you're looking at people living 30 minutes away from the city center. So this, you have a situation with two incomes, and so this is where people live in detached houses. This is sort of the suburban dream, and you're looking here at 60 to 80% of people living in such detached houses, and so this is the undeniable success of detached housing, but also where amenities are often believed to be inadequate. Well, at the same time, there are recreational areas. People can go shopping, and also people living there have about 1,500 meters of woodland and 1.5 hectares of agricultural land per capita, as it were. Well, this is a sort of indicator we are looking for. I mean, some of these indicators may be somewhat odd, but it is the sort of thing we have to look at, and hopefully in a next edition of this, we might come up with yet other indicators. One final comment: urban areas for many is where people have projects. There may be architectural projects, and of course, in urban planning, you have new ideas, and the question is, will this translate into peri-urban areas? So, will you have architectural, economic projects, family projects, residential projects? That is, at least until such time as the kids have become adolescent, and so a recreational as well as a working space, but also a new area of social life and community life. And we're working on a project right now on the inhabitability of the peri-urban area, and also a new concept of the two-car household, and where and that actually may be a defining criterion as well. But there is something of a controversy or contradiction, but there are many others. You look at peri-urbanization being a process on the wane, peri-urban being a sort of a widespread lifestyle, and you have the sort of the peri-urban rural countryside, and so you have on the one hand a very much perfected housing area. At the same time, you have natural disasters. You have sort of urban patterns sitting next to rural areas. You have an environmental challenge. People find that they either choose to live there, or sometimes they have no choice. Peri-urban is the triumph of individualism. It is a new form of individual lifestyle. It is something that people call for, but also want to destroy. It is part of metropolization. While it is also a divorce from the metropolis, it may not be sustainable, but the peri-urban is the ideal buffer space when crises break out. Well, thank you so much, Emmanuel Roux. Let me just respond to this business of this buffer space you just mentioned. Thomas Sieverts, in your work, what is to become of the peri-urban areas? What does the future hold? This role of peri-urban buffer areas, is this what the future holds for these areas? What is your view of this, about the sort of these buffer spaces?
I think buffer is not the right term for that. They become more and more independent from their home cities. They form complete networks of new forms of city by themselves. In Germany, we have a more or less closed ring from Hamburg down to Munich, closed with peri-urban areas. So you can't say this is a buffer zone to the agricultural area anymore. Like the same in the Po plain, you can't do that either. So it's a complete deform in itself. The future problems, of course, are quite obvious. You could define the peri-urban areas also as a result of the energy revolution in the 50s, turning from coal to oil. And now we have another revolution turning from oil to something else. And nobody can say what happens, neither to the concentrated city nor to the peri-urban areas. This is question number one. Second question is, in Germany, the peri-urban areas are not so very different in their demographic structure than the central cities. They reflect all the problems of aging, of polluting also. So they face all the same kind of problems and on a different degree. There's not so much difference between the suburban or peri-urban areas in the central cities anymore in Germany. The third question, what happens to mobility? And then we are here. If we could define peri-urban areas as a result of cheap automobile mobility, and to a large degree I think they are, then we have to ask what happens to these areas. I have my ideas about that, but I don't know if we are going to start to discuss about the future in this round, perhaps the next one. But I could give you a few ideas about it.
Je vous en prie.
So I think we have to have a complete different approach to the peri-urban area in the times to come, in the time of completely different energy resources, and completely different demography, and completely different working areas, and completely different ecological situations. I think we have to look at the peri-urban areas with the perspective of radical decentralization. I think we shall not get rid of peri-urban areas, as I said in the beginning, in the next decades. They're just existing, property rights existing. But all the technology will change in the next decades. So we could use repair and renewal and modernization of technology to turn to another technology, to radical decentralized technology. You could decentralize water, you could decentralize waste, you could decentralize food production, you could decentralize even schooling. If you think about schools where not the pupils commute, but the teachers commute. So my approach to this, the older I become, is a rather radical one. And this kind could lead to a completely different community and completely different kind of city. If you decentralized heavily, then you could, in small steps, could modernize the city, piece by piece. It's not so as if you have to change a whole complete global system, but you could change the system in different pieces. You could rely on urban agriculture much more than we do today. And one root of the peri-urban area was food production in the 20s, in the Great Crisis, in the late 20s. People went to the countryside to produce their own food. And this might be necessary again in the time to come. So my idea is a radical decentralization, and mobility is also very much a matter of lifestyle, that if you think of a more stabilized life, using much more the electronic media for working, then perhaps people could work from home and go to office, central office once or twice a week. And then the question of energy resources is not so very heavy anymore. So if you change your perspective, you get a complete new view on the peri-urban areas, as you might say, the structure of the city of the future. Thank you very much.
Donc décentrer le regard d'une certaine
Oh,
manière.
right. Well, meant a decentralized view, and that means that people should see differently if you want to do things differently. This is your view of things. Paola, Pucci, is this the sort of thing that you find in Italy as well? Can you feel the beginnings of a new approach to these areas? I mean, to change from the sort of a short view of things. Let me just address this, but I would also like to address this this sort of peri-urban policy. We found, especially in times of crises in the greater Milan area, I don't know if this point was made very clearly, but one thing is for sure. If you look at buildings, there are three phenomena: densification, energy requalification, and rarefying of resources. The first thing, densification, you have a selection process where you have sufficient density, but enough functional versatility that can help the social fabric by providing enough services. Well, then you have a node-based densification with a sort of an urban structure emerging, but that is something which is of interest to urban planners and politicians. Then this energy requalification, and that is because you have poor energy balances or poor energy performances of buildings in Italy, in the Milan, greater Milan area. And so this means that there has got to be a new approach to energy supply in buildings. And where it is not possible to achieve better performances, well, then buildings are abandoned altogether and replaced with other buildings. But these replacement buildings haven't really come up yet because of the crisis. And so right now there's something of a vacuum. And then regarding mobility, I may not have the exact data right here, but one, well, you have the effects of peak oil. There comes a point where gasoline becomes expensive, and we come to a point where, well, you have new modes of transportation. And in the Milan areas, and this is also to do with interesting policies, you have the congestion charge in downtown Milan, and so it means that cars simply cannot access the city center, or they have to pay a hefty charge. So this has an effect on mobility. And then there's been an investment in regional railroads, and indeed in peri-urban areas. But of course, that investment will be loss-making. But because of that, the question is, should one invest in railroads where where nodes, where train stations are far apart? Does it make any economic sense? And there should maybe be new forms of collective transportation to address the situation. As to a peri-urban critique, let me just say in a few words that in Italy, that critique has come rather late in the day. As you know, Italy has has something of an institutional situation. You have La Città Diffusa, or the work by Bernard de Say looking at the new city. But this sort of work had brought about the scattering, the urban scattering found in the models I described. So it's not detached houses, but another form of urban scattering. And only in the late 1990s did people were concerned about wasting land, or the fact that land was grabbed by private interest, and that there was a question of fixed social capital or poor amenities. And I mean, that Italy woke up rather late in the day in this respect. Thank you. Well, that is more or less the same comments that you can make about Switzerland. In other words, we see things differently, you do things differently, you have a different approach to the peri-urban space, not as opposed to, but part and parcel of contemporary society and contemporary space.
Yes, but I'd like to introduce two additional elements. We haven't talked about the allocation of jobs. We've talked about the population, but industrial jobs in suburban areas or outside main city centers, high qualified services jobs are in city centers, and low qualified services jobs are everywhere in the urban areas. The way public transport is organized is clearly oriented towards centers right now. Trains, high-speed trains are for high-qualified people working in the city centers. Cars dominate in rural areas, and normally cars are used to drive relatively limited distances, whereas public transport, if it's not in urban centers, public transport is used for larger distances. And so people use public transport only in city centers or for long distances, and so that has a major impact on energy consumption and a major impact on the possibilities to change the territorial fabric in the future. But maybe you can observe jobs re-onshoring or relocating in these new urban territories, more complex than simply center and periphery. There's a sort of accretion of jobs in some areas that offer alternatives to this type of commuting, this type of transport, which is the dominant image that we have of the peri-urban that could bring about some change. It's still modest, but it's something to be supported or organized. Of course, that requires adapted political support. Well, what do you think about that? Well, yes, of course. Jobs are shifting towards the suburban. Of course, jobs that stay in the city centers, sometimes with major investment from the private sector and with development support, all that that pattern has changed the rationale. But I would answer no if you look at how skilled jobs have shifted. There's an ever-increasing concentration in the more interesting areas. That's also where high-value added companies try to locate themselves, either in city centers or in these peripheral regions. And so the implication of that is that people come from other towns to these centers or from the far-off suburbs to the old or new employment basins. But what about new types of mobilities, not just work commuting, but also leisure commuting? We're talking about areas, as Martin Sieverts and Paola Pucci said, that have some amenities and that generate and organize practices and types of mobility that deconstruct the somewhat facile view, simplistic view of the center and the periphery. We're also talking about areas that are in between different cities and housing practices organized complex territorial modes. Is that something that you're seeing in your own contexts in Germany and Italy? Well, probably because there's denser urban coverage, but that's something that we're seeing in France. In Tulle, the role of smaller or medium-sized cities is not so anecdotal. It's something to be further investigated. People tended to focus on the big city and the metropolitan area, but right now urbanization is happening around mid-sized cities, and they're close to big cities now, so they organize territorial systems that are a lot more complex. Maybe Emmanuel would like to respond. Well, I think you're right. Although it can be said that there are peri-urban modes and peri-urban patterns, but we still think in terms of center-periphery, and that has some major corollaries in terms of political organization and thinking. However, the way people live, a lot of researchers have written about it, but people don't just think in terms of home and work commuting. I'll take a few simple examples. If you can picture where I live, Grenoble, or the surrounding area, you'll see that at the weekend there are more people around the city than inside the city on the main streets, except where there are farmers' markets. Well, it's not the case for all residents, but people love to enjoy the amenities that are close to small towns or small cities around Grenoble. And that's why public policy has been organized to think about how to connect the city center and the close periphery. Something similar to what's been going on for a long time in Austria. That may sound anecdotal, but people have described the fact that urban qualities are also related to the quality of the surrounding peri-urban or rural areas. Paola? Well, what we could see from mobile phone data is that in the Milan urban area, there are major shifts around 5 and 8. And we've got the IP identification of mobile phones, and we could show that these are the people living in the southern, poorer parts of the urban areas that leave work and that become city users in the evening. And that led us to think about how to think about communities of practices rather than stereotypical populations, not just your typical suburban commuters. There are peri-urban commuters who go to work in the morning, but when they want to go out, when they want to pick up their children, when they want to go shopping, they do travel around a lot. And one thing that's important to say in the context that I'm studying more precisely is that there aren't just strong relations with the central city, but also stronger connections with outside areas that have undergone transformations because of the economic crisis and because businesses are shutting down. That doesn't just happen in the central city, but also in the northern and eastern territories where there are denser transversal connections, where there isn't just collective transport, but also denser connections. But what about the German case? Maybe that gives us a different understanding or reading of these areas, as you say in your work.
In Germany, we just have the main problem that we have the loss of population in the east of Germany. And this is rather dramatically. And peri-urban areas, of course, have a great part of this loss. So the problem now arises if the old German tradition of serving the people by central places, small cities, bigger cities, in this hierarchical order of centers, if this is still working. And more areas, it doesn't work. So even the services have to be completely decentralized. Doctors have to have a strong connection to the central hospital, so they could send results to the hospital and get it immediately back to do their treatment. Shops are completely different organized now. More and more shops are taken over by the people themselves to run a village shop, and it works quite well. And the big distributors think about mini shops again, service centers and of service kiosks, which have a limited choice of goods, but which are very much fine geared to the population living around this kiosk. And it could be easily served if something is lost. And these kiosks could take over like in Japan and in old Greece, other services as well, caring for the dog, caring for the child, things of this kind. So I think we have to use a lot of imagination how to handle these lower densities, which we have in Germany, with completely new models. And these models run in a kind of combination of radical decentralization with a very sophisticated network system of central, which works more or less by electronic media in connection with the decentralized system.
Something more alveolar, cell-based, as it were. Thank you. Maybe Sylvain would like to take the floor? Well, just to broaden the scope for this round table, well, thank you to the panelists. I know, sir, that Jean-Louis Jourdan, you wanted to speak. I know that you wanted to say something. How is that? You're still thinking about what you wanted to say, but you wanted to take the floor an hour and a half ago. But if no one raises their hand, that's going to be up to you to speak first. Well, what I suggest is that first you introduce yourselves, your name, surname, and where you come from. And also, please keep your comments or questions concise, and if you agree, maybe we'll take your questions or comments in blocks of 3 or 4, so that as many people as possible can speak. Go on, madame. I'm Sabine Charvet. I'm a professor at the Paris-Malaquais Architectural School. In the round table, I noticed a couple of things that are essential and that may turn our debate around about the notion of peri-urbanity. Annie Fourcaut talked about spaces of self-organization where society can still adjust to problems to solve them before the rest of the population. While we may wonder about the existence of self-organization spaces, try to find them and understand them. In that case, we have 2 examples, one that's geographical and the other that has to do with social and technical development. If you look at what's going on in Detroit, where the center has become emptied, where people have reorganized and organized themselves around areas that were previously urban and that have become rural to promote a new form of urbanity. This may be a way for cities to reshape themselves, and then there's everything that was said about jobs and the different ways of understanding cities through the digital areas and social media. In my view, these are 2 interesting questions in the way we think about the peri-urban areas. And just one clarification. For 3 years, I've been working on walking as a way to understand diverse territories and urbanity. We realized that you had to turn the question around, go beyond the traditional technical development to come back to resource and rotating urbanities. I think that there ought to be some interesting reversals. Mr. Jourdan. Well, I have a question. As Sylvie Landriel knows, that's one of my hobbies. I'd like to respond to what Mr. Olivero said about the fact that cities are organized around 2 axes, imposed or chosen mobility and imposed or chosen locations. His theory is that people who have chosen mobility and location can only exist if, at the other end, the people who have imposed mobility and locations exist, because urban mobility depends on the provision of these amenities by people who do not live in the city centers. And talking about access to services in a different way and talking about future energy constraints, Well, maybe the terms of the equation will be reversed, and it will be harder to have denser amenities inside the centers because there are people providing these amenities without living there. So maybe a reversal of what people traditionally think. The problem would have to do with the density of urban cities rather than urban sprawl. Sir. I'm Dominique Boucher. I'm a professor in Denmark. I was trained in France, but over 30 years I've been teaching at Dance University in Denmark. And what strikes me is the cultural and historical factor. Things are very different in Scandinavia from what I hear here because of the political history there and the way the countries were industrialized, the differences between Norway, Finland, but also sticking to Denmark where I live. Things are very striking. Housing was scattered for a very long time, and public action for better organization was organized differently. A few years ago, for the Danish government, I conducted a survey on what are the villages that are organizing themselves and why, and there were striking differences between those who left the city to take care of their children, who didn't care about whether there were buses or not, and who developed new forms of solidarity, whereas they are supported by everyone. It's difficult not to be supported by someone else in Denmark because of the social safety net and so on. But there are also people who had moved to be closer to a bus line that connected them with a plant that then shut down, and people only met to say that, well, the others don't come to see us. And there's a third type that I find interesting. I find it interesting because I invented it. But what's striking is that we are talking as if there was a very similar global phenomenon, but we're not talking about how public policy has to do with the way political parties emerged in Denmark, the way people have different expectations from social support and contributions, and it's all rooted in tradition. And responses are different. And in a small village where I live, when there are only 200 houses, but we were the first to have a 100 megabits uplink and downlink, and that's very common. That's something very funny. Thank you. So, in fact, you are a living testimonial of Danish peri-urbanization. Yes, I turned down positions in big cities because I live 20 minutes from my university, and I have 3 or 4 hectares of land, and I produce my own veg. Okay, thank you. Of course, there are a lot of very interesting questions that were asked, but still I think that one question keeps cropping up, an underlying question in some of the comments, the issue of self-organization, and also how to take into account the history of that. The history of that organization. Self-organization is the opposite of public-controlled organization, also to be opposed to anarchical development only subject to the rules of the market. Is that? Annie Fourcaut? Well, regarding the interwar period, I'm not making assumptions about what's going to happen to the peri-urban in the future, but simply the way it happened in the dilapidated housing lots of the interwar period. Well, developers sold plots of farmland outside of any urban planning or municipal or governmental regulations, and the buyers made do to build shacks. There were no roads, no gas, no power, no nothing. That was a form of self-organization, but at the same time, these people who bought their own homes wanted the government to step in to help them develop their neighborhoods. And throughout the interwar period, people struggled. That was the Third Republic with the parliamentary regime. They wanted the MPs and senators to take care of these new self-organized districts. So they wanted to organize themselves, but they also wanted to get subsidies and money from the state to develop the place, to build roads, to have power, water, gas, and a minimum of organization. So you shouldn't be too naive. These aren't Robinson Crusoes in the suburbs living in their shacks. They lived in shacks, but they wanted also tarmac roads. Martin Sievert?
I think that's fine. I think we shall, or we must develop many different kinds of governance. And if we decentralize and if we give more freedom, we shall have completely different kinds of self-governance and decentralized development. There are so many possible solutions, from utopian, where you have your own money, until quite traditional ones, where the houses are built by the people and the services are offered by the state. And in between, there are many other things. But you can only develop these things if things are decentralized. As long as you have centralized organizations, centralized techniques, centralized service techniques, then you can't do that. And I think we run into a time which is really framed by uncertainty. I think nobody can say what happens. We only can try to experiment, to try to do something and see how it works. And for this, we need a new kind of relation between state and individual.
Thank you very much.
Maybe some further comments? Next to Mr. Jourdan. I'm Claude Soulas from IFSTAR, which is, it used to be called IDRETS. They merged with CPC. Well, not everyone knows these acronyms, this alphabet soup. So could you explain what that is? This is the Research Institute on Transport and Development. Well, I look at transport, but I wanted to talk more broadly about the organization of the peri-urban, because I think that earlier on there was a debate about the peri-urban, is that good or not? Well, we may wonder without passing judgment about how it can be organized. Before I talk about transport, I think there's a relation, talking about what I heard about self-organization and decentralization. Well, very quickly. Well, 2 years ago, I attended a symposium on urban agriculture. There was the vice chairman of ANR, and these are very interesting things, provided that you keep in mind the issues of space. I heard about 2 or 3 hectares of land. Well, if you've got 400 or 500 square meters, you can grow your own veg. Not every house needs to have 2 or 3 hectares. With 400 or 500 square meters, you can do something. And in the long term, we can think about corridors for collective transport. And around these corridors, we could use walking or cycling to have a more independent view. Not just talking about roads or organizing the peri-urban with alternative modes of transport and not just cars. Well, thank you very much. Maybe someone would like to respond? Maybe one last comment? Hang on. Just before I give you the floor, people tell me in my earpiece that a number of people are attending this forum remotely via the web. For instance, Julien Delabaca, we won't ask him where he's speaking from because he's on the web. Maybe he's in China. Well, he's in the room, actually. Where are you? Please come forward. There he is. You prefer to tweet rather than to speak. Okay, let's see if we understand. Refocusing and using new technologies, that's an interesting viewpoint. Who said that? Anyway, you simply approve of something that was said. Okay, but no specific comment. Okay, another tweet maybe? Well, you can read that for yourselves. That's technological mobility, ladies and gentlemen. Is le bug urbain in the room? Who's behind that moniker? Well, someone who thinks that we're all going to end badly and leave Paris, a preferred area for young people, but very often there are no leisure amenities for these young people. Well, this is a category-based comment. Well, a third tweet. Let's go. Well, that's Le Bug-Urban again. People tweeting have a privilege, they can ask questions twice. The peri-urban is also an area of boredom for people living in proximity because of low mobility. Well, here I'm turning to you. I don't know if you look at French film Les Valseuses in the 70s, or that film that made James Dean famous. Who said Easy Rider? No. You can be very good in terms of mobility, but not good regarding movies. Rebel without a cause. Yeah. It seems that teenage boredom in suburbs is nothing new. Emmanuel Roux, what do you think? Well, I think that what we can see through these two tweets is, well, I don't know. Maybe these people are particularly bored in life, but that's also an expression of something that's very often said by young people living in peri-urban areas. That's what I was referring to when I said that it's a preferred area to have children, but necessarily see them grow up indefinitely. Young peri-urban dwellers really look forward to exploring different urban horizons. Maybe sometime later in their life they will come back to peri-urban areas, but what's your answer? Well, this is really someone sharing their life with you, saying that they live in the peri-urban and they're bored. Well, how can you respond to that? Well, yes, I think that it's a good comment, but the same could be said about people living in rural areas or in the suburbs, the urban ghettos of some cities or city centers. It's not specific to young people. You talked about that in Grenoble, about different types of people. I think it's not specific to young people or peri-urban spaces, but still I think that this is something that's not studied enough, the issue of young people in the peri-urban. We've looked at elderly people in the peri-urban. It's true that these areas are getting older, but people like to get older in peri-urban areas, for most of the people getting older, until they reach late age. They like to live in the peri-urban until such point as they want to live in the city center. But now what about young people? There are PhD theses. Some have been presented, but we have some statistical data, but not so much anthropological or sociological data about what it means to be a young peri-urbanite. Does that make sense, being a peri-urbanite? And what does it mean to be a young person living in the peri-urban area? Do you live well or not so well? These are questions that are still hanging. There are some theses being written about that, and I think we'll hear about that this afternoon. Yes, there will be a communication about young mobility in the peri-urban. But Martin Schuler, you said about Switzerland that there was a generational divide between the peri-urban that seemed to get older, if I got you right, and different types of towns. And based on maybe what you know about Switzerland may shed light on this debate about young people and living in the peri-urban. Well, there's a question of accessibility. If you have a bus every 2 hours, if you want to go to a city center that's just 10 miles away, that's not so easy. It's not so easy to attend vocational training or attend university when you live far away from it. These things are easier in a denser context. However, there is an underlying question about communities. The most functional community so far was the town or village. It was rooted in its territorial. It had territorialized services for all inhabitants. We know that it's difficult for towns when people are very mobile. But if you want to talk about alternatives, they will probably be socially different. Here you can talk about operations, gated cities. You can talk about community-based groups. For instance, in the US, you can quite clearly see that there's a different mode of social and spatial organization. And I much prefer to have a bit more mobility to go against these segregation forces inside the peri-urban or the suburban or even inside city centers. The idea of having a town rooted in its own space is something that should be considered as a major structure. Thank you. One last message from someone who wants to join us remotely. Maybe it is necessary to rethink about cities in order to channel that rampant peri-urbanization and how to do it. That's from Jimmy Dax, not Jamie Foxx, although the message is... well, anyway, that's part of the general controversy, so maybe we cannot address it right now, but Mr. Laus, you can make a comment very quickly. Dominique Laus from Innovation and Research Department at SNCF. I have a question about time. You've talked a lot about space, but at the end of the day, the peri-urban is a matter of time, a matter of individual time. The time of cities, Poliemi, Bonfiglioli did some interesting work about that, but it's also the time it takes to access the city, as you were saying. People said that urban sprawl was not just the whole issue, but there was also the issue of time sprawl. People said that Clichy-Montfermeil is only 8 kilometers from the ring road of Paris, but it takes an hour to get to central Paris. Milly-la-Forêt is nearly 50 kilometers away, but it's only a 20 to 25 minute train ride. I know that Rickenberger looked at it in Germany. Maybe we could redefine the issue of the peri-urban from that standpoint. Well, I think that the question that you're asking is also that of connectivity, better connections.
Well, any other comments? My name is Jean-Pierre Giraud, and I live in the eastern part of the Paris area in Val-de-Marne, and I really enjoyed Thomas Sieverts' presentation about independence. I used to cycle in Quebec in Gaspésie, north and south, Gaspésia, north and south. I found something quite interesting: villages which the government felt were not autonomous enough, and so the government decided to demolish these villages. So you have families who were cut off electricity, the water supply. They were left with graveyards. They were asked to remove their houses, and I found protesters who want to return to these villages. It's a bit like in our own country, in the Landes, in the southwest. Well, it's different. In the Landes, people are being stopped from moving in, but there people are being asked to move out. But the real question: is one allowed to live in peri-urban areas? Will a day come when you will be kicked out? But I believe one should be allowed to live in peri-urban areas. And in the Paris area, with the transportation annual pass, you say for a small amount of money you can commute anywhere you like, but it costs the taxpayer 500 million euros a year, 2.5 billion in 5 years. But with that kind of money, surely you should be able to rehouse people in peri-urban areas and give them local jobs. Let me just respond to this. We talked about time, you talk about commuting time, but also the way in which time is organized. I believe if you look at this issue of time and time patterns, and if you look at maps and geography, you can see that the outskirts are away from the center, but listening to people living in the outskirts, their approach to space is much more complex than the sort of concentrated view you have when you live in urban centers. And I discovered this working with the students in the Paris area. People saying like, well, instead of going to Saint-Gervais, I go to Vernon. I live in the city. I like to work or to visit Vernon because although Vernon is far away, it's nearby by train. And so maybe we're not looking at this with with the right glasses. Maybe we should change our spectacles and realize that we may have a short-sighted view of the situation. Well, maybe Jean Afflelou, the optician, is a sponsor of this symposium. We're talking about time, commuting time, and the organization of time. But time management is also to do with providing services, because if all schools open at 8, if all offices open at 8, then you have a sort of a concentration of people being mobilized at the same time, and that may have to be reviewed. Now, I have another issue in Milan, the concept of local taxes. How do you define who pays for local transportation? Of course, usually it is people who only live in the area have to pay for the train services, but the train services are used by people who live further out and do not pay their fair share of the amenities of the facilities. And so in defining, I mean, you should have the sort of flexible boundaries to decide who should contribute in tax terms to the provision of services, to have a sort of fair tax distribution. Well, the point you're making is that you pay for services, you pay locally for services that benefit lots of people further out. And so instead of having this sort of annual pass, which would be the same price for every denizen of the Paris area, but then who should pay for that? Should it be for all Parisians to pay for the transportation of a minority, or should it be for everybody to chip in? Maybe Bernard Selem will say something about this. You, sir, had something to say. Yes, I work in a strategic center, a strategic studies center, about the strategic redeployment in our center. We looked at these poorly or low population areas. We found that you couldn't walk to places, you couldn't use public transportation, and so you had to drive. And that had a direct implication on time management. Now, what was said this morning about the sort of the organization of space was that you have a huge number of all sorts of initiatives, people finding their own system, a do-it-yourself transportation system. And so you could have bunches of friends or small companies who decided to meet daily life challenges without having to enter standard cultural or administrative models. They can still find a way around their transportation or other challenges. I'm not saying that initiatives were any good, but the interesting thing is to see whether these initiatives could survive and could be copied. And indeed, there's some work being done about this, and ADEM, the Local Authorities Association, is looking at such methods and trying to see whether there are ways of helping people who are left out of some of these services. And the idea is to try and copy examples from one territory to another. So what you're saying is that in your Center for Strategic Studies, and not everybody is familiar with the many French government agencies, but the Center for Strategic Studies is the successor of the planning department that was created by General de Gaulle, and there will be a new body that will be created, but this is sort of the think tank of the French government. So the Center for Strategic Studies promotes the bottom-up approach and believes that the French peri-urban countryside, as it were, is the French Far West. Somebody wanted to say something in the back of the room. Thank you. My name is Dominique Millot, and I work for GISTAR. GISTAR is the French Institute of New Technologies, Networks, and urban planning. Now, we are concerned about the role of government in all this. We found that peri-urban areas could well be seen in a negative light, in a positive light. You could see the amenities, you could see the fact that people were imposed this lifestyle, or they may have chosen it themselves. But whether you want this or not, you find that while at the same time some people, either by choice or through obligation, were living in these urban areas, while the sort of official thinking was that it was not right to live in peri-urban areas. People had to live in denser populated areas, more densely populated areas. And so there's a policy in favor of density, and so that left out peri-urban areas, and while at the same time that movement was continuing. People were moving out to the suburbs. And so you have a tension right here, and so hence this concept of considering these peri-urban areas as a buffer states that could make it possible for people to weather the crisis. I mean, that is one view of things. So there is a policy situation, but there's also a financial situation. When public finances have privileged city centers, who is going to pay for these peri-urban areas? Look at the tramways. It looks like the idea is to benefit the outskirts, but in fact, most of the money, most of the investment is done in urban centers rather than peri-urban areas. So you're talking about public investment, public capital expenditure. Who would like to respond to this? Annie Fourcaut. We only have a few minutes to go. I'll make a very short comment. It is rather unusual for denizens of these areas, but also for architects, technocrats, or urban planners to agree amongst themselves. Usually, people living in a neighborhood, the planners, the politicians, they have different view of things, and the whole problem is right there. The idea is this sort of a confrontation, this clash, which may not always come to a resolution. And of course, if you're looking at the 30 years that followed World War II, 30 years of economic prosperity, you had these big urban projects called the Grands Ensembles being built at the same time. So how do you account for this contradiction? On the one hand, you have these big housing projects outside the cities, while at the same time you leave it to private initiative to develop these areas that were sort of built out of control. You have to speak in the microphone. And please introduce yourself. My name is Nicole Lemaire. I work for the Technology and Society think tank. It's true that public policy is never consistent, and the fact that people moved out of detached houses to build housing projects, but this was to do with the fact that people could not secure property loans. But when the loans were almost interest-free, then when housing loans became interest-free, people could afford to build their own houses. So that's a reason right there. But there's yet another reason, and that's still to do with public policies. If you look at some of the things that were said this morning, people said it would be good for peri-urban areas to have local jobs, etc. But on the one hand, you can't develop home owning in favorable financial conditions where people, or rather in unfavorable positions where people have to pay interest for years and years. And then saying that people being told that, well, you have to change jobs 15 times in your lifetime. So you have contradictions there. I mean, on the one hand, people have to stick in one area because they have to pay back their home loans, but at the same time, they're told they have to move about throughout their working life. Something of a contradiction there. You wanted to respond to this, sir. If you want to wind up with this round table in time for the lunch break, well, instead of looking at the peri-urban universe as being the place that is disqualified, that is out of the picture, looking at this in a place in its own right, and that has to be reflected in public policy. But we're a long way from this. We're still, in fact, public policy is still trying to control or indeed do away with peri-urban developments. But at the same time, as the lady said, there are public policies that are precisely promoting peri-urban development.
In Rechten.